All right. So welcome back. This afternoon, we're going to hear from three very different perspectives. And these three different perspectives, I think, are really important because they intersect in the core of what the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium needs to be useful to NASA, to be useful to the nation, to be useful to all of you as well. We have first Tory Bruno from ULA here to talk about the cislunar economy, and I met Tory 5 or 6 years ago, and I got to tell you, I at that time was running an X Prize team at Penn State, and I was enamored of the amazing things that were being done at Blue Origin and SpaceX, and my students were going off to work at places like Virgin Galactic, as well as Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin. And I thought that was where all the excitement was. And then I saw Tory speak at an event that the Atlantic Magazine held in Atlanta, where we were on a panel together. And I was reminded of the fact that in order to do anything successful in this industry, you have got to be pushing the limits and visionary in terms of what we do. And I'm really, really pleased that he's here to talk again, not just because of what I saw then, but because also of your role on the National Space Council's User Advisory Group. One of the things that the UAG and the National Space Council has been discussing is mentoring in this industry to bring in new actors, new contributors to space as we grow more and more beyond just what we've done over the last few decades. So without further ado, please help me welcome Tory Bruno to the stage. Okay. So thank you. Do you have to give the turn?
She's got it.
She's got it. Okay.
Wherever she is. There you are. Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. And thank you for your time and attention. So I am going to talk a little bit today about how our country's current ambitions to go back to the moon, to have a sustained presence, to have this Artemis program are going to open the door to a multi-trillion-dollar cislunar space economy and pave the way back to Mars. So I'm going to tell you some things you already know, but I'm going to put them in that context. And where is George Sowers? George, raise your hand. Where are you? George Sowers is back over there. So if what I say is brilliant, it's all me. But if you don't believe a word of it, that's the guy right there, George. All right, hit the next slide, please. All right, now it is a legal requirement that whenever a launch service guy comes to a meeting like this, there has to be a rocket video. So bear with us for a moment. Oh, I think that was a Parker Solar Probe rocket went by there real quick.
You have permission to launch. We have liftoff of the United Launch Alliance.
Liftoff of the United Launch Alliance Delta IV rocket.
All right, I think you get the idea. Let's go ahead and go to the charts. We build a lot of rockets. All right, so before we start, I just wanted to put this return to the moon maybe in a little bit of perspective. So what we've done is put every lunar mission ever onto this one slide. And so the stuff that's on the bottom on the surface of the moon, those are missions that touch the moon. And the ones that are on the top are missions that orbited the moon. And of course, as you can see, back in the 60s, there was a tremendous amount of interest in the moon. And then Apollo ended, and it was a decade and a half before we cared at all. And then finally, we returned in a modest way to lunar orbit. Go to the next slide. 3 decades later, we managed to get out there and actually touch the moon. And by touch, I mean that ULA smashed a Centaur upper stage at extreme velocity into the surface of the moon, which is really cool. And as you guys, some of you may know, threw up ejecta that allowed us to confirm the presence of water on the moon. But 3 decades before we even went back with an unmanned, uncrewed rather, probe, so to speak. Next slide. And when we put people back on the moon in 2024, it is going to have been over half a century since people have stood there prior. And I think it's about damn time. What do you guys think? All right, so that's the context. Go to the next slide, please. Now, I thought even though most of you are familiar with Artemis, I might just roll through it very quickly because, you know, nothing against my friends, but just between you and me, NASA has a way of making this look like rocket science. And so I'm going to simplify that for you a little bit. This is how it's going to work when it's all running. There's going to be a space station, not unlike the ISS, out there sitting at the Earth Moon Lagrange point 2, nice, stable, low energy to maintain orbit. And it's going to be orbiting there, and then SLS will lift this big old Orion capsule with half a dozen or so astronauts. They will go on out, they will dock, they will hop out, and some of them are going to stay there and do deep space research in this Gateway space station. Now, a lot of you think it's the Lunar Gateway, but I'm going to argue that that's really the Mars Gateway space station. Now, a little bit later, I'll tell you why, because it really is the pathway to get us safely and routinely out to Mars. And then the others are going to go down to the surface, and the way they're going to do that is they're going to hop in that vehicle that you see there, and then there's a transfer vehicle that will bring them down to low lunar orbit, let them go and go back. It's reusable. And then they will coast around in low lunar orbit till they're lined up with their selected landing point for that mission, descend to the surface, hop out, run around for several days doing research and, you know, astronaut things, climb back in. The ascender will take them back all the way to the space station, leaving the descender down on the surface, and rinse and repeat. So that's how it'll work, not that complicated. Now, how does that all get into place? Go to the next slide. Well, SLS will take the heaviest pieces of Gateway up there, obviously, and then probably most of the commercial providers in the sort of space launch vehicle class that exists today will bring up all the smaller pieces and then do the logistics work of keeping this thing going. There's food to be brought up there, there's propellant, there's things to be refueled, there's instruments and all of that. So that's an ongoing operation. Obviously, ULA will be a part of that, as will others. Go to the next slide. So let's see how the missions play out. So the first thing is we're going to send robotic landers to the surface of the moon before we send people. And that's what that sort of lower bunch of arcs are. There's one in the middle that I think is the most interesting. That is the, where's Astrobotic? Are you guys here? Where's Astrobotic? All right. All right, so we're going to take Astrobotic's Peregrine lander to the surface of the moon on the very first inaugural flight of our brand new Vulcan rocket next year, early next year in 2021. And then maybe just as interesting is way down in the left-hand corner, because I'll come back to that later, will be exploration missions to the poles to investigate ice and things like the potential for ISRU of that ice, potentially maybe even something like a strategic reserve of fuel on the moon. But I'll come back to that later. So those missions are happening. Meanwhile, on the top arc, there's an Artemis 1 that flies out, loops around the moon, uncrewed, and flies back. End-to-end test. Life support work, propulsion work, nav work. Good. Then Artemis 2 will go out, do the same thing with people. Meanwhile, we'll be building up this Gateway space station until finally it's done and Artemis 3 takes people, docks with the space station, people go down. And that begins this permanent sustained presence. So that's the mission. It's not that complicated. Go to the next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about something you all know the numbers, but we have a hard time as human beings grasping the unimaginable vastness of space. So I just want to take a slides and try and get that in a way that we can sort of appreciate it, because space is unimaginably big. And even going to the moon involves tremendous distances to be traversed. These are, the slides I'm going to show you are scale drawings now. We don't do that very often. So there is Earth to scale. It's around 9,000 nautical miles in diameter. And there's one of our most popular destinations, Leo, most popularly about 1,000 miles up from the surface of the Earth. And then the other very popular place we like to go is Geo, and you guys know why. That's where you put a satellite that appears to be fixed in the sky. Only about 22 times further out, 22,000 miles. So we understand that. We do this all the time. Go to the next slide. Okay, here's the moon. Can't find Leo anymore on this scale. Now we're talking about 230,000 miles out, so a factor of 10 to get out there. And then the other place we really want to go in this discussion, one more, Bill, please. Let's get out to Mars. Whoa, 250 million miles. At our sort of average, or really on the closer side of our closest approaches, where it's practical to travel. Can't even see geo at this distance. That is a tremendous, unimaginable, vast distance to traverse. And it matters how big this is when we talk about sending people there, because of the time it takes to get there. And so I haven't shown it to you out of scale. I haven't shown it to you on a log plot. I've shown it to you how it actually works. But now it turns out that while distance matters for the time it takes to go there, it doesn't really matter in the cost to go there. As you guys know, it's really all about the energy to go there. So I'm going to change the scale to delta V, kilometers per second. Let's go to that one. And the entire thing collapses. This is still to scale. And so all of a sudden, the moon is just right on top of Leo, which is right there in the middle of the page. 9.5 kilometers per second on average to get to Leo. Not very much further than that to get all the way to the lunar surface. And just a little bit more than that again to get all the way out to the surface of Mars. And there we are. They really are all close together in terms of energy. And the moon kind of in a way, it sort of is on the way to Mars. And so, if only we had a way to practically travel around between the moon and near-Earth objects and Mars, you know, if only there were, say, like energy out there that we could use, you know, propellant is what energy is for us in the launch business, and if only there were propellant out there in space, it would be practical to have a routine transportation system between all those interesting bodies where there is all kinds of interesting science to be done. But there's something else we can do out there. I mean, I love science, but there's one thing I love almost as much as science. Anybody know what it might be? Somebody said money. Kinda. Money. Oh, I heard Robbie over here, Robbie Sabatier, say what Tory loves almost as much as science is a multi-trillion-dollar sustainable cislunar economic zone. You all heard her say that, right? Absolutely. All right, so why would we want to go there? That's why. Go to the next slide. So you guys kind of know this, but on the moon and on the near-Earth objects within reach of the moon are tremendous natural resources. Natural resources in such abundance that it defies human imagination. When we rack it all up, our best understanding is there's about 1,000 years worth of Earth's entire planetary production of industrial metals. Iron, titanium, nickel, manganese, all of that stuff. Right there, just right there within a few delta Vs of where we are starting from on the moon or in Leo or anywhere nearby. And in terms of precious metals, golly, there's more sitting out there than has been extracted in 20,000 years of human history. More than that. Tremendous wealth. This is the opportunity not just for a $1 trillion economy, but really, if you think about it, for the beginning of a post-scarcity human future. We are not talking about a future that we stare into for our children and grandchildren that is ever diminishing, where resources are ever more scarce, where they must seek and strive to live ever smaller lives, but a future where abundance is almost beyond our ability to comprehend. That's what's laying right there on our doorstep, a scant few days from this very room where we're sitting right now. If only there was propellant laying around out in the cislunar region for us to go out there and take advantage of and not have to lift up from the gravity well of Earth. Go to the next slide. Oh my gosh. There's 20 billion metric tons of water sitting on the moon. And as any chemistry student knows, because we've all done this experiment in school, it's a rather trivial matter when we did the electrolysis experiment to turn that into oxygen and hydrogen. The most energetic, practical chemical rocket propellants commonly in use today. Just right there. And a tremendous quantity of it. Now, when I show this and talk about this to people, sometimes someone will say, Tory, I think you're saying that water is the crude oil of cislunar space. I say, yes, I am. And then sometimes it will say, well, gosh, aren't we just going to use all that up and run out of, just like we are here on Earth with those fossil fuels? Well, probably not. So at today's demand, if we could source our propellant in space instead of from the surface of the Earth, we'd use about 200 tons a year. Well, that's about 100 million years. But in fairness, I'm talking about this giant, 10, 12, $15 trillion a year economy that this eventually grows to. So we're probably going to use some more. So let's say we use, 100 times that demand. Well, that's good for about 1 million years. So I think we're okay. All right, go to the next slide. Well, it turns out it's not just about the natural resources that we can develop in space. It's also about things we can do in space that we cannot practically do here on Earth. These are some examples of things that you can manufacture in microgravity that we can't practically do here. High purity fiber optics, for example, very complex and delicate tissue additively manufactured or grown in space that we just can't do here because of the density effects here on Earth that we can do in space. And so, God forbid any of you ever need a kidney or a heart, an artificial heart, for example. Well, how about a real one that we grew from your actual tissue? What would that be worth to you? This is a bright future we're looking at if we can only tap these resources. Go to the next slide, please. And eventually, when all of this infrastructure is in place, that is going to be kickstarted by the Artemis program, our first permanent research program, and not just scientific research, but industrial research. NASA grasps that, embraces it, as does the Space Council, and we are routinely building large structures in space from materials that we source there. We can have near ubiquitous, low-cost energy anywhere on the surface of the Earth, where solar generation can be done, where it is never cloudy, it is never night, and the energy density is 10 times higher than we get here on the surface of the Earth. What will that do for the state of human dignity on our planet? Go to the next slide. I'm not the only one with this idea and this vision. There's a whole crowd of people. We've helped gather them together into a little club we call the Cislunar Marketplace. There's over 200 companies, universities, entrepreneurs that want to go forth and make this happen. There's a sample of some of our partners in there. We're about to have another big event in New York this year where we will do more studies and generate more papers. That'll be cool. All right, go to the next slide. Now I'm going to change gears for a minute. I'm going to come back to Mars because I told you it is not the Lunar Gateway. It's the Mars Gateway. We can't practically and safely send people to Mars today. There is a lot more research to be done to figure out how to do that in a way that we don't harm them. And we need to do that in a deep space facility, like Gateway, which happens to be sitting next to the moon, because that's a twofer. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. I'm going to pick on one of the challenges that many of you in this room know about when we talk about extended duration of time where we put people out in deep space. So go to the next slide. Let's talk about radiation. All right, so we're going to work our way up. I'm plotting on the vertical dose equivalent for you, so millisieverts, this radiation that's making it into your body. It's kind of jumbled and averaged out together because different kinds of radiation do different things to your tissues. But in general, we can look at it this way. That first little bar is the cosmic radiation that makes it through our planet's magnetosphere, makes it through our atmosphere, which is a great radiation shield, equivalent roughly to like 30 feet of water. Pretty good stuff. And down to you, this is what you're getting probably in the room right now, about 1/3 of a millisievert. I get more than that because I live at 7,000 feet, Colorado. But that's what we're getting. And so when we put that together with all the other stuff in our environment, natural materials, X-rays, and the people sitting next to you, and if you eat bananas, all of that kind of stuff, works its way all the way up to about 3.5. And that's fine. Biological systems are awesome. They are self-repairing. And of course, this ionizing radiation, so radiation, as you guys know, with a certain level of energy, at least 10 eV, well, ionize, it'll strip electrons, it'll disrupt molecules. When your cells are getting hit with this right now in this room, some of your cells are being damaged and some of them are dying. And your body has no problem with that. It's either repairing them or replacing them, and you will go on and none of this will matter. Let's go another build. Here's an abdominal scan, 8 millisieverts. This is why your radiological technician is wearing a lead apron whenever they are doing this for you. By the way, living in Colorado and putting a couple 100 hours on an airplane every year, I get a lot more. I'm closer to 5. So you guys, cut me some slack here today. All right, now let's get out and see some references. So if your daily life, if your job exposed you to something in the neighborhood of 20 or more millisieverts every year, you're going to get classified and regulated radiation worker by the Energy Commission. And you're probably going to wear a dosimeter to work every day, and they're going to make sure you're safe. And you are. You're totally safe at that level. Go to the next one. Okay, if you do a 6-month tour on ISS, you're around 70 to 80. That's above that. In fact, it's even above the annual limit we would allow a radiation worker to be exposed to. But that's okay too, because you're not going to live on the space station. You're going to be there a handful of times over your career if you're an astronaut with NASA. And you're closely monitored, so that's fine. And you are below where the stochastic cancer threshold exists. That's well accepted at about 100 millisieverts per year, where you would have a measurable increase in your risk of contracting a variety of cancers, because some of those cells didn't get damaged, didn't die, they mutated and they became cancerous. So you're below that, and that's cool. Go to the next slide. Now let's do a 6-month transit to Mars. Okay, well, that's quite a bit more if we're not protecting you during that transit. And you're not going to spend 6 months going to Mars and 6 months coming back to Mars and not stay. So you're going to put about a year on the surface, and that's the standard reference that NASA is working to for a mission to Mars. So that's that effect. And so let's go ahead and build up the whole mission. So there you are. There's 1 year out, 1 year on, 1 year, 6 months out, 1 year there, 6 months back, 2 years. Where is that cancer limit again? Oh, that's pretty far down the scale. And so without protection, you send 5 or 10 people, 1 or 2 of them are going to come back with cancer. And if you do that all the time, you can pretty much guarantee that. So this is something we have to deal with before we go to Mars. Go to the next slide. Oh yeah, did I mention proton storms? So solar particle events. Periodically, if you're not familiar with this phenomenon, our sun decides to blast a giant death ray of radiation off its surface out into space. And now, if you happen to be in front of that death ray, we're not talking millisieverts. We start measuring things in sieverts. And along that timeline, which is to scale, are some of the known ones, beginning with the Carrington event back in 1859, that set telegraph stations on fire spontaneously. A little bit later, we had the geomagnetic storm of 1921, where we had telephones then, and telephones quit working for a day or two. And then the next storm that we are aware of in 38, transatlantic radio stopped working for about 12 hours. And then we kind of fast forward. The one that kind of really holds my attention is that next storm, the solar storm of August of 72, because Apollo 16 went in April, and then the storm hit in August, and then 17 went in December. It was a pretty powerful storm. It's considered one of the most dangerous storms to humans in space at the time. Had they been there, sea mines were spontaneously detonated in the ocean as a result of this, for example. Those astronauts would have certainly been injured and possibly would have been killed had they happened to have been in space in front of that blast in August instead of in April and December. So that's kind of a big deal, dodged a bullet there. Then you can see more. Then we roll forward to the Hubble servicing mission back in '99. I'm pretty sure that Sonny Williams, our astronaut who's going up this year on Atlas, was in that mission outside the station, and that's the Bastille event that occurred a few months later, and so on. You get the message. That graph in the bottom is prompt exposure. I was showing you slow exposure on the previous set of slides. And so at 2 sieverts, you're going to get hurt. You're going to get burned. You're going to vomit. You're going to have diarrhea. You might lose some vision. You're going to be injured. Now we get it up to 4 sieverts. 60% of the people die without medical attention. By the time you hit 8 sieverts, everybody dies. We don't have a lot of data for this. We're pretty sure of that. Most of that data comes from Chernobyl. Anybody watch the TV show? A few scientific inaccuracies, but you get the idea. So we got to deal with that too. That's also part of it because we're talking about having people in space for a year. And we're talking about having them on the surface of a planet without a magnetosphere or much of an atmosphere to speak of either. And we're going to do it over and over. Sooner or later, we're going to get caught by one of these if protecting them and planning for it. So next slide. But good news, we're studying the heck out of the sun. I think year before last, we put Parker up. Super exciting mission. Data coming in. If you haven't seen the data, you should look at it. It is super cool. Last month, we put the European complementary mission, Solar Orbiter, that will be at an inclined orbit so it can see the poles really for the first practical time. And of course, as I said, the gateway, the Mars Gateway, is going to put a station in deep space exposed to this. Big difference from ISS. When you're in ISS experiencing the radiation that's there inside the Earth's ionosphere, it's like being outside on a pleasant summer day in the sun. Very different in comparison to the freaking giant microwave oven that exists in deep space on the moon and at the Gateway Station, where we can effectively research this before we commit people to a Mars mission. And once we let them go from the rocket, I mean, that's a year. You can't get them back, even if they decide not to land. You go and you come back. There's no way to really fix that that's practical. So the research that gets done here is going to make it practical for us to go to Mars. Go to the next slide. Back up. Thank you. So you guys, a lot of you guys who are familiar with radiation are familiar with our current practical understanding of how to shield for it. The stuff on the left just gives you a little bit of feel for what's called the quality factor. Remember I said these sievert levels are kind of all wrapped together, and this is what kind of makes it into your body, but they all affect your organs in different ways. This is one of the ways that you compute that as you're working your way down to the calculation of damage to a specific organ. It's called quality factor, and just roughly speaking, an alpha particle of radiation, for example, which is a helium nucleus, is about 20 times more harmful than a beta particle, which are electrons or positrons. That's what that means. But good news is, you know, alpha particles can be shielded with a piece of paper. Awesome. Beta, you can shield with thin aluminum. That sounds like a spacecraft shell, so that's not too bad. Gamma, well, lead, other thick metals. That's getting a little less practical. Neutrons are more of a thing here in the nuclear power industry than in space, but still, and they also have the potential not just for secondary radiation, but to make other things radioactive. So that's a problem. And of course, finally, what we're really talking about are cosmic rays, which are really a big soup of all of the stuff that's above it. And typically at much higher power levels. So in a way, this is a little deceptive because a cosmic ray alpha particle that's originated, say, outside our solar system has a lot more energy and may actually penetrate right through the aluminum and into your body. That's pretty rough stuff. And you can see the common ways we shield with that is concrete, lots of water, boron, stuff like that. Now, I can tell you, as a honest-to-God person who designs and builds rockets for a living, a rocket scientist, that lead and concrete are not our preferred materials for spacecraft. This ain't going to cut it. We're going to need some new materials that are a lot more efficient at shielding out this radiation. You know, plastics with a lot of hydrogen. There's all kinds of stuff started, but nothing that we could use today to safely send people to the red planet and back. This is the research that's going to get done on Gateway and on Artemis and make it possible for us to actually do this instead of just imagining that we could go to Mars tomorrow. All right, go to the next slide, please. All right, so it's another legal requirement that I point out that I have launched 137 times and never once failed to take our mission to space. We're damn proud of that. And finally, I am done with charts, I think, and can take any questions you might have. Do I have time for that? All right. Thank you.
Do we have time for a couple of questions for Tory?
So if you ask me any hard ones, I'm going to give them to Sowers.
Okay.
Or Robbie. Robbie seems to have this nailed.
Tory, thanks for your vision of the trillion-dollar cislunar economy. One thing that we've seen in all the presentations, ISRU, habitation, surface mobility, they all depend on power.
Yes.
And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on putting power plants on the moon to sort of, if you build it, they will come type thing? Because every process that we're talking about needs power.
Yeah.
And I think if we look at holistically what you want to do in a cislunar economy, there's going to be a lot of power needs.
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of use simplistic analogies. So when the Industrial Revolution got going in the Western world, you know, we started with things like water power. That's kind of equivalent to using solar on the moon, where we have, again, so much higher power density than we have available to here on Earth. Thank God, if the power density were 10 times higher on Earth, we'd all be crispy. But also, fortunately, just as the Industrial Revolution moved on to coal and eventually discovered what kerosene was all about, once again, there's 20 billion metric tons of high energy fuel sitting on the moon. So I think really the essence of your question, though, was really directed at how does this get going? What are the economics of that? And so we're actually off studying that right now. And I will say that I think one of the great opportunities that government has to help start what we've just talked about is the same role government has always had in economic development, which is to pool our resources to create infrastructure that lets this get going. So for example, we need to mine the propellant on the moon. We need to make it available on the moon. Wouldn't it be cool if we had a strategic lunar propellant reserve, not unlike the petroleum reserve that we hold in Texas? That would, through public-private partnership, because there is a business case for private companies to participate in that, just not the entire one on day one, to build that infrastructure, to mine the ice on the moon, to refine it into propellant, to use that then in power stations to provide electricity for the other activities we want to do on the moon, and let private industry sell the excess capacity to its commercial customers that then want to run out to the near-Earth objects and prospect them and eventually develop them and so on. So I think it's really about government helping to kickstart through infrastructure the economic activities that will follow. Was there a hand over here? Yes.
Yeah, Tony, Gary Barnhart, XISP Inc. Excellent
Gary.
presentation. But one of the things that we've heard earlier is this notion of increasing the velocity of decision making. Okay, what's in your mind the most concrete step that can be taken in the next year that will make a difference to moving towards the goal of the cislunar economy?
In the next 12 months. Yeah. So the first, I'm going to give you a couple of different things, and some of them will sound more exciting than others. The first thing is to embrace the Artemis program. This is finally our opportunity where the government has said, here is a major multi-billion-dollar commitment to put permanent infrastructure on the moon. Quit squabbling over whether or not near rectilinear halo orbit is perfect or any of this other stuff, and get behind the damn program and row the rowboat. That's number one. There's always a better way, but now's the time to move. So we want to build that momentum, get this in place, and in advance of that first lunar polar research station looking at ice and how to manufacture propellant, we need to start working the policy piece of this, because I'm talking about private industry in space, a self-sustaining commercial economy that will make it impossible for us to just plant a flag and go home when we get bored. But you can't have a business, God forbid, I'm going to have to say it, you can't have business without regulation. Where's Bob? You know this. It plays a part. You have to have the right to go out and put your ice mining claim in place, own that, have the right to mine it, have the right to sell what you pull out. We don't really have that legal framework now. It's ambiguous. What's to stop somebody from jumping your claim? And, you know, all of that. What's to stop someone from behaving irresponsibly in orbit where the things are different? I mean, we know about navigation of the seas and not, you know, leaving hulks in people's way, but it's different in orbit. Orbital velocities. You can do all kinds of irresponsible things up there that will make it impossible for anybody to do business. So I'll give you those two. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me where you come up with the number of 20 billion metric tons? Where'd you come up with that number?
I can tell you where I came up with the number. So NASA has a number of papers, and they all have different numbers, and we kind of averaged it. But this is why we're going to go. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's 10 billion metric tons. Gosh, there'll only be 500,000 years worth of propellant. Who else?
Well, one more here. This is Clive Neal again. Keep talking about resources and the water ice on the moon as if it's all there and we can get it. We don't know that. We really don't know that. So it's great to have those sorts of numbers up there. But there may be 20 billion tons of water on the moon, but how much can be extracted? What is the reserve potential, i.e. economically extractable water ice that can be used and produced for a profit? That's what we're talking about in this space economy. It's one of the big things, I think, is the essential next step for that $1 trillion economy. We've got to go prospecting. We've got to figure out where the richest ones are that are extractable, that we can get to. Shackleton Crater looks great. You can't get in it. It's a very steep slope. So we have to look elsewhere. There are places on the moon, maybe not at the South Pole, but there are places where we can do that. It's the essential next step to put that vision, actually make it work, to know that we have reserves rather than resources. So we use resources and reserves interchangeably here. They're not the same. So we have to be careful. And I think we really need to push to understand that that is real potential. Right now it's potential. So I think that's an essential thing for this group to think about. Can we actually start getting data that will initiate that type of economy? And that's going to be game changing.
So I'm not sure there was a question there, but I let you go on because that was perfect. That's exactly why we need to get this program in place, get onto the moon, and do the research. That's why we need to do this. Am I out of time?
Yes.
Hey, thank you, everybody. Thanks.